Hello friends, welcome to the Bible Project Daily Podcast. And this project is for us to work together through the whole Bible, chapter by chapter, verse by verse. You're welcome whether you're here for the very first time or you've been on this journey right from the very beginning. Please bear in mind that you can take part in this project at whatever pace that suits you. New episodes are posted every day, usually Monday to Friday, and you can choose if you've gone right to the very beginning to just listen to them in the right order, whatever pace suits you. Now today is a little bit different because if you've been with us all along, you'll know that today we've just finished 50 days spent studying the book of Exodus, which means we'll be launching off on our next season, which is going to be the Gospel of Mark. And if you're wondering why Old Testament, New Testament, that's the way I decided to do it. I didn't think that people would, or even I would find it difficult to stick with this if we were going to wait for maybe 6-7 years before we even got into the New Testament and got to be introduced to the person of Jesus, so to speak, which is why I made the decision very early on to do alternate seasons. So we've done Genesis and we've done Matthew and we've done Exodus. So next on our list of our time together will be the Gospel of Mark. Now what I tend to do at the point of a big season break like this is not launch off onto a new season straight away midweek. So we've got a couple of days here, maybe 3, which I'll put some bonus material in before we launch off on Mark on Monday. Just to give you a background to what this bonus material is, I have a Patreon website, which is a place where people who have committed to support this ministry financially, anything from £2 a month, $3 a month, to a little bit more than that. Now on that place I put bonus episodes of just my thoughts, my musing and my preparation notes. And whenever I'm given an opportunity to sort of speak in these areas or just be involved in a discussion group, I do some preparation at trying to come into these situations and find a common ground, or sometimes there's not a common ground, in which case an intersection point where I can try and bring and apply some Christian biblical principles into the area of thought that's been talked about. And those either recordings of those live events or recordings I make of the notes I've done in preparation, I make available as bonus episodes. So that's what I'm going to do today. I'm meeting with a psychology group that I meet with once every 3 weeks, and we're going to be discussing the works of Jean Piaget. Other bonus episodes that I've made available on the Patreon are things like an overview of the life and theories of Carl Jung, a talk called Are People Naturally Good, which looks at a Chinese Taoist philosopher called Mencius and look at how that sits alongside a Christian worldview. Also a critical analysis of Sigmund Freud's theory of interpretation of dreams from a Christian response, also a direct Christian response to Taoism, and some stuff in terms of philosophy, looking at a Christian apologetic around Aristotle's famous writing Politics, also looking at the Stoic Handbook, the Enchiridion, and also a Christian response to Crito, which was the famous lengthy dialogue by Plato, and also some notes I did in reference to the psychologist William James and his book Principles of Psychology and his other groundbreaking book Varieties of Religious Experience. So these are all responses, apologetics if you want, a Christian perspective on all these things. So today is bonus episode which I'm dividing into 3 parts, and it's looking at the life of this psychologist, groundbreaking in terms of child development thinking, called Jean Piaget. So the 3 parts that we're going to give you is going to be, first of all, just a factual overview of his life and his thinking, and then episode 2 tomorrow will be a more critical analysis from a Christian perspective of his various theories and ideas, and then finally 3rd episode will be a pretty clunky recording of a Bible study teaching session I did about 6 or 8 years ago at a minister's meeting and then again at a church one evening, where I looked at one of Piaget's theories and applied it to the Exodus story, particularly the call of Abraham and his desire to see the seed of his generations come through as the children of God. And in doing that, I look at where one particular of Piaget's theories sit in with that foundational call of Abraham as revealed in the book of Genesis. So, with that said, I hope you find it interesting, a little bit different, and I'll see you again tomorrow, I trust, on the Bible Project Daily Podcast. Bye-bye for now. Okay, friends, today I'm looking at the wife of Jean William Fritz Piaget. Born 1896, died September 1980. And he's a Swiss psychologist mainly known for his work in child development, his famous theory of cognitive development, and his views on how we as human beings, obviously initially as children, learn, and how we attribute knowledge has been labelled genetic epistemology, widely recognised in all areas of thought today, particularly those of child development. These are my notes and thoughts in preparation for speaking at a psychology study group this week. Piaget was famous for recognising and documenting, probably for the first time from an academic point of view, the importance of the stability of the family group and the education of children. He actually became director of the International Bureau of Education, based in France, and he famously declared in 1934 that only education is the thing, that it is only education that will be capable of saving our society from possible collapse, whether that be violent or gradual. His theories of child development is studied in educational programs around the world to this day, and educators continue to incorporate his strategies into his teaching methods. So how and what value of it can we learn today, and where does it sit with the Christian worldview? He actually continued to hold important positions, not only in education, at what was called the Centre for Genetic Epistemology, which was started in Geneva in 1955, and he continued to direct that institute until his death in 1980. The impact that that centre had and the stuff that came out of it on learning in terms of education in societies and in schools across the world is seen as absolutely unprecedented by anybody else, and it actually became nicknamed as the Piaget factory for the number of pioneering educators it turned out. Now, though Piaget wrote widely on many different areas, and for many years, his ideas really became hugely popular in the 1960s, and it led to the whole emergence and the study of development, child development, as a sort of major sub-discipline within the whole field of psychology. His was really the first school of child psychology and child development. It's reckoned that by the end of the 20th century, that in this day and era, Piaget, probably only second to a guy called Skinner, are the most cited psychologists in the modern era. So what I'm going to do to begin by today is giving you a quick overview of his personal life and his thinking before returning tomorrow to analyse his theories and his thinking from a Christian perspective. So in terms of his personal life, he was born in the picturesque town of Neuchâtel, which nestles in the heart of what is called the Francophone region of Switzerland. He was said to have a brilliant mind from a young age. He entered the world in the year 1896, and he was the eldest son of Arthur Piaget, a very highly esteemed professor of medieval literature at what was a respected regional university based in Neuchâtel. His father married a woman called Rebecca Jackson, a woman of French origin, but also hailing from English descent through her Lancashire-born great-grandfather, steelmaker and industrialist James Jackson. From an early age it was evident that our young Jean possessed an extraordinary intellect. Even as a young child, he was captivated by the wonders of the natural world, particularly biology. He had a really deep-seated curiosity and a passion for understanding the intricate workings of life, and he brought, from a very young age, a certain amount of acclaim to the community and the town in which he was born. At the tender age of 15, Jean had already made a name for himself in the field of zoology, catching the attention of many esteemed professionals through his remarkable publications on mollusks. In fact, some have claimed that it was at the age of 10 he was first offered a position of curator of mollusks at his local zoo. That have not been able to qualify, but what can be claimed and is documented is that his interest in zoology earned him such a reputation in his field that he had several scientific articles published on mollusks by the age of 15 in very respected journals, and he was actually offered the curatorship of the whole zoo at the age of 15. He didn't take them up on it, by the way. Yet amidst this sort of burgeoning scientific zoological career, an intriguing incident from John's childhood would leave a mark on his memory forever. At the age of 15, a letter arrived from Jean's former nanny, apologizing for a lie, a falsehood she had told his parents during the time that she looked after him as a very young child. She confessed to having falsely claimed that she had heroically repelled an attempted kidnapping of the 3-year-old John from his pram. However, the shocking truth that he discovered that day was that that event never happened and no such kidnapper ever existed. And this revelation really intrigued, if what might say troubled Jean, because for him he had a vivid memory of that event, but apparently that event had never happened. The enigma for him, the puzzle for him, and he would ponder this and write about it for years to come, was that how come he had such a clear memory of something that apparently never happened. It ignited an interest within him to unravel the mysteries of the human mind, the ideas of cognition and the development of memory. So through this events and the troubled confession of his nanny, the seeds of Jean Piaget's remarkable journey were sown in those early teenage years. He had an insatiable curiosity and thirst for knowledge, which would drive him to become one of the most groundbreaking and important figures in the field of modern psychology. He is the one that can be reasonably said transformed our understanding of how children think and learn. Through endless research, he would become known as a trailblazer, shaping the very foundations of what is called developmental psychology, and leaves his mark on that community and educators to this day. This memory of his nanny's fabricated tale served as a catalyst for propelling Jean down a path of inquiry that would shape his whole life and work. The story begins from an academic point of view with the influence of his godfather, who recognized Piaget's insatiable curiosity as a young teenager and encouraged him to explore and go wider into any realm of philosophy and logic and thought that he thought of interest. Piaget's intellectual pursuits in the end very soon took him to the University of Neuchâtel, where he eagerly absorbed knowledge and was academically honoured with his critical thinking skills. This curiosity burned bright within him and pushed him to expand his horizons further. So he then ventured from the regional university to the University of Zurich, seeking new opportunities for intellectual growth. During his time at the university, Piaget's passion for understanding the human mind developed, and he published 2 philosophical papers there that capture the essence of his thinking at that time. However, as he matured, he dismissed those early works as mere reflections of his adolescent thought, grounded more in philosophy than in the field of psychology. But it was during that period that Piaget's interest, by being drawn to the very popular theories of psychoanalysis at that time, began to take root and draw him into this burgeoning field of psychology, but in a more evidence-based way, perhaps, than some of the other famous psychologists from that era. Eager to share his knowledge and contribute to the education of young minds, Piaget relocated from Switzerland to the vibrant city of Paris, whereby he remained academically, at any rate, for many years to come. He completed his studies there and actually landed a role teaching at the Grange Obel Street School for Boys, an interest led by the renowned Alfred Binet. Now, Binet, he's the man behind the Binet-Simon intelligence test, which is in fact the first formally recognised and applied IQ test used by the French government at that time. As fate would have it, Piaget's involvement in that school and as a research assistant involved him marking these intelligence tests of hundreds, perhaps thousands of children, and it would prove to be a turning point in his life, because while evaluating the answers to the IQ tests, for want of a better word, they're sort of a proto-IQ test. IQ tests, when they were developed later by Binet-Simon and then by H.J. Eysenck, they became much more centred on logic, but at this stage they had a wider sort of remit. But what he noticed and what intrigued him was not the wrong answers in themselves, but because he began to notice consistent patterns of mistakes made by young children, and though the older children made other mistakes, they made different types of mistakes or made the same mistake in a different way. And he also noticed that when approaching those questions from an adult's point of view, they managed to avoid making the mistakes in this way. This realization sparked the beginnings of the radical idea in his mind that there was a cognitive process in young children that is entirely different to those of adults. Driven by this newfound information and this new perspective, Piaget would go on to produce a comprehensive theory of what is called cognitive development and applying stages to it. According to his theory, individuals, all of us, exhibit distinct patterns of cognition during various stages of development. This was a groundbreaking concept and would forever shape the field of psychology in our understanding of human intelligence. Up to that point, people thought children were just little adults and that they just grew by learning more and more knowledge, sometimes even drilled into them by rote. In 1921, Piaget returned to Switzerland and assumed the position of the director at the Rousseau Institute in Geneva, an institute overseen by the well-known Swiss neurologist, psychologist and educator Claparède. Piaget was no stranger to Claparède's ideas, and he eagerly embraced and did research and developed the idea of that time of what was called intellectual groping, what we would closely identify as the notion of learning through trial and error in human mental patterns. And it was in the midst of this period that he found love and companionship, and as I say, he married in 1923 a lady called Valentine Châtenay, and together they embarked together, working as a couple, supporting the development of their own 3 children, who, it has to be said, became an extensive part of Piaget's studies and appeared in most of his research, from their infancy through to early teenage years. From 1925 to 1929, he served as professor of psychology, sociology and philosophy of science at the University of Neuchâtel, returning to his hometown. And then later in 1929, he accepted the challenge of director of the International Bureau of Education, and he would hold that esteemed position for nearly 4 decades until he retired in 1968, and through that institute, many would say he shaped educational policies on a global scale. He passed away in 1980, leaving behind quite a remarkable legacy. But as per his own request, he was laid to rest with his family in an unmarked grave in the Cemetery d'Oie in Geneva. And though he had departed this world, his revolutionary ideas continued to shape understanding of cognitive development in the human mind and affects educators to this day. Jean Piaget's thinking remains significant today for several reasons. Firstly, because he pioneered the field of cognitive development and was the first to provide a comprehensive framework to understanding how children's thinking evolves as they grow, and his groundbreaking 4 stages of cognitive development are still widely recognized today and used as a basis for educational practices. Secondly, his emphasis on the concept of readiness, suggesting that children should be taught specific concepts when they reach, and only when they reach, the appropriate cognitive development stage. And this idea continues to influence modern teaching methods, emphasizing what we would today call individual-centered, person-centered learning. And thirdly, Piaget's research highlighted the importance of active learning through hands-on experience, trial and error, problem solving, how vital that is to children's intellectual growth. And these principles continue to shape educational ideas and approaches to this day. And also Piaget's, finally, I would say, his emphasis on the role of curiosity, exploration, and social and societal action as being important in learning. All of this thinking and ideas still today resonate with contemporary theories that value what we would today, I suppose, call the holistic development of children. His legacy continues to influence researchers, educators, policymakers as they attempt to foster the best types of learning environments for children and intellectual growth. And that is the man and his life and his thinking. Hi friends, welcome to the Bible Project Daily Podcast. And we're in our between season couple of bonus episodes. Taking a break between having finished season 5, which was the book of Exodus. We've just spent 50 days in there. And on Monday of next week, we'll be starting off working together through the Gospel of Mark. I do like to have a short break and place a couple of bonus episodes in between, the sort of stuff I'm putting on Patreon for those people who are supporting this ministry before kicking off in a brand new season. I like to start a new season light-eyed and bushy-tailed on a Monday morning. So this is the second of 3 bonus episodes themed around the life and work of Swiss psychologist Jean Piaget. Today we'll be diving a little bit deeper. I'll be hopefully providing a bit of a Christian critique of his influence and his research methods, and to see what he had to say on morality and how that sits alongside a Christian worldview. Then think about his influence on philosophy and, you might be surprised to know, artificial intelligence, a key figure in the development of the earliest versions of computer linguistics. I'll then examine some of his main theories and consider them alongside a Christian worldview. And then tomorrow we'll come back and I'll be posting an episode with extracts from a series of talks I gave over 2 evenings some years ago, where I analysed Genesis chapter 16 using some of Piaget's thinking to help bring some insights into understanding that chapter. Not using his theory to establish any form of theology, rather just looking at what his theory revealed in the light of what was very clearly in place in Scripture already. So I hope you find this a little bit interesting, a little bit different, and it just gives me a little bit of time. This work had been pre-prepared for a talk I was giving at a local study group, so it was quite easy just for me to very conversationally quickly turn it into a couple of episodes and give me a little bit more preparation time for the main project relaunching again on Monday in the Gospel of Mark. So I'll remind you that he was born at the tail end of the 19th century, and in fact born in Switzerland, and worked actively until 1968 and died as recently as 1980. And his work was groundbreaking work. In many ways, it laid the foundation for our understanding of how children's thinking develops. His journey from initially natural history, almost zoology you might say, took him through to the fields of philosophy and eventually psychology. And many would say he revolutionized the way we see children's cognitive development progress. Though his ideas evolved and changed over time, his legacy continues to influence educators around the world to this day. Piaget's bottom line belief was that as we grew up, as we developed, our understanding of the world steadily becomes more and more complex. He explained these developments between his two main ideas of assimilation and accommodation, which we looked at yesterday. In the field of child development, he observed over the years many children and young people to try and test and see how knowledge develops. And he found what he believed, that all children, all people went through different stages of development, building upon what they had already learned as they went along. And they would do this primarily doing actions and then reflecting, thinking about the results. And by recurringly repeating these actions and observing how things behaved or responded to them, people as they develop gradually gain knowledge and skills, and their way of thinking and their way of doing things steadily became more advanced. So really what Piaget was saying is that his emphasis was on that individuals actively engage in constructing their own knowledge and understanding of the world. In other words, they build their own worldview based on experimenting and the influences of things around them. But he underpinned this by saying the purpose of it, the psychological driver for it, if you like, was always an inner attempt to achieve a state of equilibrium in ourselves and within the wider society through this gradual assimilation and accommodation of understanding. His idea on what he called individual readiness, that idea continues to influence modern teaching methods, leading to a focus on active learning, problem solving, social interaction, and that intellectual growth and education, particularly of young people, but one might say in approach to education all your life, I think, that it should be a sort of stages of progressive educational approaches based around the ability level and the adaptation of the learner. And this legacy continues to impact researchers, educators, even policymakers and politicians as they strive to create the best learning environments for children in the societies in which they're involved in. But there are some now who would criticise Piaget, particularly because of his research methods. In fact, some would say he sits within that school of thought prior to the 1980s, where there was no real scientific testing or model in the development of the field of psychology. So many of his research methods, even though carried out in the 40s, 50s, 60s and 70s, would be considered problematic by today's standards of not just psychological but any form of scientific research. For a start, his studies relied on very, very small samples, and they certainly weren't randomly selected. For example, one of his most important books, The Origin of Intelligence of Children, was actually based in the study of just 3 children, and that included 2 of his own. So that means it's very difficult to generalize Piaget's findings and apply them strongly to larger population models. Also, his interactions with his research subjects were unscripted, which means this would have led to obviously clear variations in the conditions around the interaction with the children. So you've got real issues of consistency across a research subject or something, which is very much the opposite of the idea of modern practices, where researchers would work off set scripts and the emotional content of the questioning would tend to be reduced as much as possible. Having worked as a social researcher for a brief period in the past, part of our training very much involved us sticking to the script and not emotionally reacting to the participants' responses to the questions. In other words, what we might call a poker face, not showing anything that would in some way suggest that you disagreed with or were judgmental or even agreed with what the candidates were saying. This certainly would not have been the case in the way Piaget approached with his samples. And of course, Piaget at that time, as most people would have relied on handwritten notes made in the field after the interviews, instead of using either independent scribers or even electronic recorders as would be used today to ensure robust data was collected. Critics would argue and say today that Piaget's experiments did not adequately take enough control, particularly in relation to the social contract of the selecting of the samples of the children, or recognizing that the development of the child could be very much linked to the social environment in which they lived, particularly in their use and understanding of language. So this would naturally lead to making conclusions which wouldn't really be validated or backed up. Interestingly, when scientists more recently have tried to replicate Piaget's experiments, they noted that even small changes in the procedures could bring about vastly different results. And this in itself must challenge Piaget's interpretations of his test findings. But in spite of these criticisms, and in spite of the fact he no longer is being considered fashionable and is not taught in terms of the application of his methods in the most recent fields of child psychology, his actual soft influence remains extremely significant by the fact that his teaching methods, for want of a better word, have been adopted by many educational systems around the world. So whilst many aspects of Piaget's theories are no longer accepted by mainstream psychologists, his legacy as the founder of what we call today developmental psychology is widely acknowledged. Many educators today would still use Piaget's theory to try and help understand their students and how they worked as learners, because his approach focuses on the individual and encourages active construction of knowledge. And teachers who adopt this approach consider each student's unique qualities, abilities, attributes when planning a curriculum that's person-centered. And the desire would be to provide as much as possible hands-on experience, take student insights and value them, feedback, nurture their curiosity, and create an engaging learning environment, one where the student or the child feels safe. He was a strong early advocate of what is called teacher praise as a way to serve as a positive reinforcement for students who are learning. However, it has been recognized today that many would say that once students get into the adolescent phase, students prioritize social connections with peers much more, and in fact would go the other way and would actually no longer value respect or praise from a teacher because they begin to see them as authority figures. But let's be clear, Piaget's works influenced greatly changes in education, particularly during the 1970s and early 1980s. And he is the key man in developing a more individual, child-centered approach to education. He was the one that was really the first to recognize the importance of fostering individual creativity, and these led to innovations in education rather than teaching by rote and conformity ruling the classroom. However, it's important to note that there have been some misinterpretations of Piaget's theories in education by leading some to sort of leave students to their own devices to the point of not providing sufficient direct instruction, which is seen to negatively impact particularly on low-achieving students, not recognizing the fact that there are some who need much more guidance and support from their teachers to make meaningful progress in their learning. Thinking a little about Piaget's teaching on morality, Piaget's theory of morality is important because he defined morality as something based on philosophic principles, things that he called universality and obligation, rather than being cultural norms, which suggests, of course, that morality, therefore, is something that exists outside of us in and of itself. He believed that moral development happened through the interactions among everybody with everybody, rather by being directed by human authority figures. He believes that our peers, The society around us plays a crucial role in shaping moral concepts such as equality and justice. His theories and his research on morality had a significant impact on his subsequent work on moral development that he continued right up towards the end of the 20th century. And his theory of revealed moral development have been used to examine the development of religious ideas as well as scientific thinking, recognizing stages of understanding in the development of faith and the moral judgment as applied in different historical periods. And interesting, Piaget's thinking has also been used to explore the origins of human intelligence, which in turn led to a significant impact on the field of early computer science and the development of artificial intelligence. A guy called Piaget uses Piaget's work when creating the Logo programming language, one of the earliest computer language, and a British computer scientist named Alan Kay based his concept of the Dynabook programming system on Piaget's theory. And the discussions around this concept led to the development of the Alto prototype, which explores elements of the very first graphical user interface, the GUI, the understanding of the way in which we interact with technology, leading to the development of on-screen icons and even ways of manipulating data on the screen with the use of a mouse and the like. By people interested in studying his models of how we learn was applied to machine learning and the creation of the very earliest user interfaces in computer language, mostly done in the 1980s. But in spite of all this, Piaget's theories have faced criticism for various reasons. Some argue that different cultures prioritize different social interactions, which challenges Piaget's idea that development must follow a specific order. Others point out that Piaget didn't fully understand the underlying mechanisms of information and how we process from one stage to the other. Over time, alternative theories of child development have been proposed, and many modern research findings challenge Piaget's ideas. While supporters of Piaget argue that his critics sometimes misinterpret his theories, it's clear that his work has significantly contributed to the development of psychology and to our understanding of how children learn. However, when considering some of his theories from a Christian perspective, there may be certain aspects that raise concerns or require thoughtful consideration. So thinking about Piaget's worldview versus a Christian worldview, one of the key areas of potential concern is Piaget's emphasis on the individual construction of knowledge and the relativistic nature of moral social development. From a Christian point of view, there is a belief in an objective moral order, a standard that's rooted in God's character and revealed through Scripture. Piaget's theory, which suggests that children create their own moral ideas based solely on personal observation and peer interaction, many would say would conflict with the whole concept of there being an absolute moral truth. Furthermore, Piaget's theories implies that children's cognitive development might progress almost independently of external influences or guidance, which of course would include religious instruction. This raises questions then about the role of faith and the importance of religious education in a child's overall development. One might say their overall moral development. From a Christian perspective, the role of spiritual formation and the influence of Christian values in shaping a child's understanding of the world would be considered absolutely essential. Another point of contention may arise from Piaget's focus on biological and cognitive development. He puts much less emphasis on the spiritual dimension of the human experience. Christianity recognizes the holistic nature of human beings and that it encompasses not just physical and cognitive aspects, but also that there is a spiritual dimension. Piaget's theory, while valuable in understanding how our brains develop and grow, they do not capture the spiritual aspect of human development in any way, which is an integral part of the Christian worldview of what it means to be human. It is worth noting that many Christian scholars have engaged with Piaget's theories and integrated them into a Christian framework. they sought to reconcile his ideas with Christian beliefs, emphasizing the role of God's grace and the work of the Holy Spirit in this developmental process, leading Christian scholars of his work to highlight the importance of a spiritual formation and foundation needed to be part of our ability to reach a comprehensive understanding of human nature, something that incorporates into both our cognitive and our spiritual dimensions. An area where the Christian worldview and Jean Piaget's theories do share some common ground is what we would call schemas and his ideas of equilibration. Both share common elements in their understanding of knowledge, growth, and development. The term schema is an important one. In Piaget's theme, a scheme is a mental framework or a structure that organizes and interprets information. Similarly, from a Christian perspective, we as individuals develop cognitive frameworks or schema based on these beliefs, values and understanding of the biblical teachings, and these schema shape their perceptions and interpretations of the world. Also, his idea of equilibration, in which he proposed that cognitive development occurs through this process of seeking to maintain a balance between our existing schema and the new experiences that come in. Well, in the same way, a Christian worldview recognizes the importance of spiritual growth and maturity, and Christians should always strive for a balance in understanding of their faith by always being willing to integrate new knowledge, new experiences within their existing belief as they progress on their journey of faith. And this, of course, this faith journey leading to a deeper and further revelation of God is exemplified within the journey motifs of these earliest biblical stories, the faith journeys of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Moses, etc. You see, both Piaget's theory of equilibration and a Christian worldview acknowledge, I believe, that growth and transformation occur over time. That God not only works miraculously, but that he also works continually by natural means that we incorporate and experience as we travel through our life together. So Piaget's view of cognitive development was, in a sense, a journey through reflecting, a progressive journey through reflecting, which led to a sequential development of cognitive understanding. And I would say, from a Christian perspective, individuals are seen also to take a transformative journey of faith, where they spiritually mature, they have an ability to understand deeper spiritual matters, meat as the New Testament describes it, as opposed to milk, and thereby develop a deeper understanding of God's truth. So in a sense, part of both what Piaget said and I believe what Christianity says, that our knowledge and our understanding and our outworking of God is actively constructed by us as individuals going through the living faith whereby we interact with the environment, which is exemplified in the phrase that we are followers of Christ, that being a disciple means being a follower of Christ, more than just statically believing in him, but actively making a decision to base our life upon that journey of following him and his example. The Christian worldview emphasizes the importance of active engagement with the world in order for us to understand and incorporate the biblical teaching into the everyday life and develop at a deeper level our personal relationship with God. Because in that process of that journey, we are constantly in the state of gaining additional spiritual knowledge and understanding of how our actions and the reactions of the world around us and the events around us can be incorporated and develop and deepen our view and understanding of things. Piaget talked about it in terms of assimilating new ideas into existing schemas and adopting those schemas to accommodate the new experiences. Well, similarly, in a Christian thinking and a Christian worldview, all of us are encouraged to grow in our understanding of God's truth and adapt our beliefs and behaviours in the light of those lived experiences. Having said all that, it's important to note that there are parallels. Yes, there are parallels between Piaget's theories and a Christian worldview, but there are also areas of real potential tension and difference. Of course, Piaget's theory focused primarily on cognitive development, how the brain develops and how we think, whereas a Christian worldview encompasses a much wider spiritual growth and linking it to the moral formation of us as individual people and the societies in which we live. And Christians, of course, would also consider the role of God's grace and the influence of the Holy Spirit as being key in that developmental process, which is something which goes way beyond anything Piaget's theories would ever seek to address. The important thing, I think, to say is that people like Piaget and other philosophers and psychologists, their understanding of the human condition, all of them, all of these ideas, all of these theories can be used to help illustrate or to, in some extent, throw light and illuminate doctrine, but they can never be used to establish Christian doctrine or theology upon. I believe that Piaget is one of those psychologists whereby we can use some aspects of his theories to definitely throw a light on a Christian worldview and provide us with some insights in how we as individuals grow and learn, and how we as individuals can develop both cognitively and spiritually. It can help individuals integrate their faith with their understanding of the world around them, and indeed can, I believe, throw some lights on how we exist as whole people. So I'll just close off what I'm saying today, that while Jean Piaget's theories have stood the test of time and provided some valuable insights into child development, any comparison and compatibility with Christian perspectives requires discernment and a critical analysis. We have to remember that aspects of his teaching, such as the relativistic nature of moral development, and of course his neglect of the spiritual dimension of the human condition, mean that we need to operate with extreme caution if attempting to integrate them into Christian beliefs and values. In other words, use them, as I said earlier, to define theology rather than to throw light on what is plainly expressed in Scripture anyway. But I think it's fair to say that some of his understanding of how children develop and how they should be encouraged and educated do line up very comfortably with Christian values, and probably have led some, particularly over the last 100 years or so, to develop a deeper and more individually centered understanding of how children actually develop and how they can be encouraged, which seems to me fit nicely with a Christian worldview. Okay, that's it for today. I'll come back tomorrow with this Bible study on Genesis chapter 16, where I'll bring in some Piagetian ideas and thoughts in my interpretation of it, particularly this idea of the equilibrated state. So with that all said, I'll say bye-bye for now, and I'll see you back here tomorrow. Bye-bye now.
One of the things that never ceases to amaze me is how this book, which was produced thousands of years ago, goes on affecting the lives of individuals, but also society and cultures. You know, medieval people planned projects that they knew would take over 300 years to complete. Cologne Cathedral, for example. Now that's unimaginable today, both within the ideas of society, but also within the ideas of Christians and the church. It seems we often can't think beyond next week. Businesses don't plan beyond next quarter's balance sheet. They totally live in a reactionary way to the circumstances they find themselves in. But here we have something that was written thousands of years ago, yet is still up to date. Who would thought that words on a page, on a scroll, would last longer than huge monuments built with brick and stones? Abraham, by the fact that this was written down and recorded, shows these ancient people weren't just thinking about their children and their grandchildren or even their grandchildren. They were thinking about the whole society that would be established and follow on for this for thousands of years. This is probably the first example on a societal level of what Swiss psychologist Jean Piaget called a yearning for a balanced state. This idea is planted right at the heart of Scripture, and we're told this on several occasions. Here in Genesis chapter 6 is the first point in the biblical narrative where we see the idea of moral progress not only being established by individual morality, but also in proper, balanced relationships between people, not just between an individual and God, but between people and each other within that society. This is, although a very ancient story, it's probably the first written account to show the emergence of what we would call today simply a fair society. This is the beginning of a nation of people and the beginning of the very first society. Remember, Abram's name change to Abraham means he will be declared to be father of the nations. You see, God's not asking Abraham just to think about his family and his personal situation. You see, his actions and what he's been asked to consider are going way beyond that. What God is asking Abraham to establish is a way that means that people can live and work and prosper together, a way in which things can be structured that build people up and works for everyone's benefit. And that, by definition, is the definition of a godly way. Not just right then, not just next week or next year, but right down into the future, and I believe we're still benefiting from that today. This is the way in which God ordains that relationships between people should be set up so that humanity can remain sustainable. God's ideal is that the family, and then the wider society, should in some way be a conceptualization of living the holy life, something that is prefigured and prophesied and representing an end goal of the descending of the eternal holy city to earth in Revelation. That is what we're meant to be aiming for. It's something like trying to make something a reality in the day-to-day way in which you live your life, which reflects, in a sense, the higher path that God has called and directed to, with the end goal in mind of paradise. So how can we start to live that way today? Well, how about this as a suggestion? Begin by mending broken relationships in your family. That's a good start, friends. Then maybe think about mending relationships within the wider family that you should be connected to. That's a good start. But to do that in a way that is effective and sustainable, it must be underpinned by having the right view of God and who God is. Our view of God is critical to our thinking because there are very different views of God that people hold out there. Our view of God as a father or a tyrant is absolutely critical to the type of society or family or individual character which will manifest those people who seek to do on earth as it is in heaven. So the question is, but what is your view of God? Is God a tyrant? Is God a dictator? Or is God a father? Some see God's rules as barriers that if breached will lead to us being sanctioned or even punished. And others see God's rules as loving limitations that he has set up, in fact, for our own protection. So you can see, friends, the idea that you cultivate of God is really very important. A famous Swiss psychologist called Jean Piaget, he's a man who was known for his groundbreaking work on child development. He applied this thought to the human family from an academic point of view. He said that if you took a well-functioning family and compared it to one where the father was a tyrant and everyone was under control, and then compared it with a family well-functioning with a supportive father, the important thing that he discovered was he was the first to identify that when you put two such families in a sort of head-to-head competition and compared long-term how things worked out for them, he identified what he called the equilibrated system of the family unit, which is, in other words, the well-functioning family unit. He said that would flourish and way outperform the tyrannical system. Now, that may seem like nothing new or groundbreaking, and most people would go along with that view today. But what Piaget also identified was that this principle also applied on a societal level. What he said was the enforcement of tyrannical rules in the end would slow down society's developments because you get resistance from inside the system within that societal structure, the pressures in the system begin to become counterproductive to the purposes of the goals that people are aiming for within that society. And what tends to happen, he said, was that more time and more effort is needed to be spent on enforcement of rules, and that ties things up and that bogs things down to the point where development of that society stagnates or sometimes even can lead to collapse. That's interesting. Maybe that goes some way to explain why liberal democracies have always economically outperformed dictatorships. I find this really interesting and exciting to discover that there's impartial evidence that explains why there is a measurable difference between the systems of, say, the Maoists or the Stalinists in Russia or the Nazis in World War II, or even those modern Islamic caliphates, that there's a huge difference in how those societies develop and the well-being of the people when placed alongside well-balanced, moderated Western democracies. Now, that may seem a bit of a sideline, but I'm saying this because I firmly believe that it is this point in the Bible that God gives birth to the idea of a nation state, somewhere where mutual dependency between people and accountability will have that at its heart. And it starts initially here. It's revealed and begun here within the family line of Abraham. Today, few people can have a concept beyond thinking about their own lifetime. The fact is, we do need to take a longer view of the world, and Abraham here in this story and his meetings with God was clearly concerned about these things, and it also seems that God was concerned about them because he wants to make a covenant with Abraham that if he maintains, the most important thing will come out of it will not come to him, but will be to his descendants and their descendants in the greater, longer term. So many Bible experts talk about how this passage flags up for the first time the need for personal moral integrity and the need to integrate it into your everyday life. You see, these Old Testament stories are the beginning of humankind understanding that the stability of the family and thereby the wider society is dependent on the integrity of the individual and the moral code that people follow. And the idea that is beginning here in these ancient texts revealed, first of all, in the Pentateuch, will become more and more fully realized as we progress through the Bible, firstly through the Ten Commandments, and some would say it reaches its high point and is completed by Jesus' teaching on the Sermon on the Mount. Today, many try and dilute this way of thinking, refusing to acknowledge the fact that integrity in your life, and particularly your spiritual life, should be dependent on following the moral law of God. A moral law that is accessed by trusting in the truth contained within these texts and expressed by building a society that reflects those truths and enables everyone to operate within a culture of trust.
Now, about 20 years ago, I read a very interesting book called The Wealth and Poverty of Nations by a guy called Professor David Landis. That book is now recognized by historians and economists as being very valuable, offering some extremely valuable insights. That's because it introduced something new into the economic debate when it claimed that the only true natural resource in society was interpersonal trust that existed between people. The book argued that if you can set up a society where people can trust each other, then that society will quickly become rich and stable. Landis identified how in some countries at the time he wrote this book, he was talking mainly about Russia and South America, countries that were, although rich in natural resources and have been for a long time, were still corrupt and economically underdeveloped. He also pointed out that for many years Africa had been identified as a continent rich in natural resources, and particularly, he pointed out in the recent years, that they'd found many new materials there that were of specific value to the computer industry. Yet for the most part, many of these countries were still catastrophically poor. So the book really tried to attempt to document the relationship between interpersonal trust among citizens and the standard of living that was found there. And a very close relationship was seen to exist between those two things. That's interesting, isn't it? Now, from my personal experience, a very modern illustration of this in recent years for me was the phenomenon of eBay. eBay was a company that started in North America and quickly spread across all of North America and Western Europe. Now, as a retail business owner in the 1990s, I was a very early adopter of this site. I first went on it in 1997, maybe early 1998, and started trading as a business seller there in the year 2000. When I wound my business up in 2009, I had completed over 50,000 sales on the eBay site. Now, originally, when I joined eBay, there was no feedback system. Early on in 2002, I attended an eBay meeting for business sellers at a big conference centre in the UK called the NEC in Birmingham, and was asked to go on what was called the eBay University team. Now, that was a bit like a help panel for small businesses and entrepreneurs who wanted information on how they could begin to sell on the platform. Now, that position was a voluntary position, as many of the early roles in eBay were. You see, the thing was, when eBay launched, when it first started, everybody said it wouldn't work. The popular narrative was that if you buy a used version of something on eBay, you'd pay for it, and the seller would probably just send you a broken piece of junk. And if you were a seller and you sold something on eBay, the buyer would send you a check, and you'd send out the item, and then the check would bounce. But interestingly, that's not what happened at all. People who had never seen each other from all around the world began to interact with each other and sell stuff to each other. You no longer had to live next door or close enough to someone to meet with them face to face to buy and sell to them. And remember, this was before there was a feedback system on eBay. The deal was that you would describe your goods honestly, including any flaws, and that you'd set a reasonable price. The buyer then would send a check, or sometimes, believe it or not, a great deal of the time they would send cash in those early days through the post, and you'd receive the money and you'd post out the goods. And you know what? It worked. What happened was eBay success, it flourished, and it produced and released an enormous amount of capital that was previously frozen up. Now, frozen capital is when you've bought something, invested in something that is no longer of use to you, then its value gets tied up and is just sitting tied up in a redundant item. So all of a sudden, all these things, all this value that was just frozen became accessible, and everyone got richer together. In my case, the motivation for joining eBay was I just bought a business, and part of its stock were tens of thousands of illustrated prepaid phone cards. Now, no one collected those cards in the UK anymore, but I needed to get something back for them. And if you don't know what a prepaid phone card is, well, I suggest you go ask your mum or your dad. But none of that trade could have happened without the covenant that was established between each individual on that site. And it was a covenant initially predicated on nothing more than trust. You might say that honesty and trust were the real currency on eBay in the early days, and they certainly were the real value driver of that site. Now, that's interesting because when a society has trust and decides together to adhere to a set of external values and put those at its core, something permanent can then be built there as well, because people can have the confidence to live lives in the way they want to and the ability to thrive and to prosper. Now, the Old Testament, these stories, is telling us how humanity, the earliest days of humanity, spread out and prospered, and it's suggesting that this happened because things were being established under God's principles. The first truly equitable society is being built here upon God's foundations, way back here in Genesis chapter 16. Abraham has made this agreement with God, and he decides that the starting point of that agreement is the simple statement that he will have faith. He will trust in God. He's going to aim high and try and live a good life, and he's going to try and tell the truth, and he's going to try and obey the Lord as best he can. And that, my friends, is a decision of faith. And that act of trust, it puts a spiritual fence around him and his descendants. It's a bit like a walled city. That's why the building blocks are in place for God not only to bless him, but to make his descendants be blessed as well, and as numerous as the sand on the beach or the stars in the sky. It doesn't mean things won't be difficult and complicated when we choose to live this way, but it does mean that God can put a hedge around us. These parameters means that there may on occasion when we slip up be discipline if we stray outside beyond God's limits, but we know that he has also promised that there will never be a general judgment like God sending a flood. These early stories also told us that God says he will never do a general judgment again in that way, because now he's going to make all of us individually responsible. So you know what? No matter how bad things get, they won't get so bad that there'll be a catastrophic judgment against everyone on earth, because God's grace will now be exercised on a one-to-one basis, and individuals can access the grace of God even when a judgment falls. And that is why the new covenant with Abraham is so important. And it's important to note that it no longer will be just a written code.
God says he'll never do things again in that way because we're now all individually accountable. It's no longer just a written code. It's something that in the fullness of time we will discover can be written into the hearts and minds of individual men and women. But that means in order for individuals to understand the benefit of the new promise that God had given Abraham to hear, that a codex was written, the law would be placed on parchment before eventually being revealed into the hearts of men and women in the new covenant. This original covenant, the first one made with Abraham, he later recorded in a documented form. But then again, a new covenant would come along, and we too, just like him in his day, we too must play our part in maintaining it. Sadly today, for most people, they no longer know about it, but those that have heard about it don't really know what it means. But back in the day, Abraham was very concerned about what this promise might mean for him and future generations. And God was clearly concerned too, which is why he makes this promise with Abraham that the covenant would go on working for him forward in time and his family line, and it would bring to him everything that he needs. So that's the position, and that's the promise that was revealed. But then after a long gap of years, Sarah comes along and says, I'm not really happy about the fact that I haven't had any children yet. And she reached the conclusion that the Lord must have kept her from having children. Therefore she says to Abraham, go and sleep with my slave girl Hagar. Perhaps I can build a family line through her. So that's not a small thing. Now, I don't imagine that Sarah was exactly happy about what's going on here. The thought of turning over her maid to her husband, she must have known that this potentially meant that she would be usurped in the whole childbearing and the inheritance thing. On the face of it, this might appear to be a major sacrifice on Sarah's part. But what happens in this chapter will have a profound impact not only on Abraham and Sarah, but on the world today, right up to this day. If you've been going through this book of Genesis with me, especially since chapter 12, you'll know that in this Abraham story, this promise was first revealed to God way back in chapter 12. In fact, not just that he would have children, but a multitude of children would come, and out of him would come a great nation. Then in chapter 13, he says there's going to be so many children, they're going to be like grains of the sand. And then he comes back again in chapter 15. God appears to Abraham again, reveals himself to Abraham again in chapter 15, and says, Abraham, these children that are coming, they're going to be like stars in the sky. That's how innumerable they're going to be. You're going to have so many children, you're not even going to be able to count them. And in chapter 15, God ratifies that contract and says, I absolutely promise I'm going to do this. You're going to have a son, and through that son, you're going to have more descendants than you can even imagine. But here we are in chapter 16. She hasn't even got pregnant yet. And you've got to remember at this point, Abraham's 85 years old, and she's 75 years old. And it's 10 years since God originally revealed himself and spoke to Abraham about this. So Sarah here in this opening verse went to Abraham and says, you know what, go sleep with my slaves. Perhaps I can have a family through her. Now that sounds strange to us today, and I'm sure we wouldn't think that was the correct thing to do in that day. But as a matter of fact, this would not have been considered unethical, amongst people at that time. In that day, the slave was the property of the wife, and according to the culture of the day, this type of behavior was perfectly legitimate. One of the main duties of the wife was to bear children, and if she didn't, she could use the maid to bear children on her behalf. As a matter of fact, the religious code that existed at that time and preceded the Ten Commandments, the code that operated in that area, was called the Code of Hammurabi. And it said exactly that this is what you should do. In fact, in their codified laws, this was number 46. So this was the custom of the day, the normal custom of the day. But in the light of what's going on in Sarah's life and Abraham's life, there is, of course, a difference here. What has gone on in their life is God had promised them that they were going to have a child, Abraham, through Sarah. So her going to Abraham and suggesting this, it shows a real lack of faith, doesn't it? She's not trusting in the Lord. She's not living by sight. She's not living by faith. So what did Abraham think? What did Abraham do? On a practical level, he probably thought, well, according to the customs of our day, there's not really anything wrong with this, ethically or morally. But remember, God said the heir would come out of his body. And unfortunately, just like Adam before him, who followed Eve, Abraham listens to the voice of his wife. So there's unbelief going on here on both parts. And the text, as I said, tells us Sarah, his wife, took her Egyptian slave to Hagar and gave her to her husband to be his wife. And he slept with Hagar and she conceived. Isn't it amazing that these events that are described that are taking place nearly 4,000 years ago, it reads like the storyline of some modern drama, doesn't it? Hagar's given by her mistress to her husband, the mistress's husband, which is Abraham, and once pregnant, Sarah then begins to despise her. So there are two things going on here. Firstly, she was giving Hagar to Abraham as a wife, but then Hagar starts to lord over Sarah a little bit. I would say Sarai took a risk, a wrong-headed risk, granted, but she probably did make a big emotional sacrifice in allowing Hagar to become her husband's concubine. And maybe she felt a little bit of gratitude would have been in order. So it's interesting that we have here is what's called polygamy. Abraham is now seen to have two wives. Now that was practiced in that day, in that culture. It was allowed by the local laws and customs of that time. But it's not what God planned at all. The other thing that is interesting is that once Hagar conceives, she despises her mistress Sarah and she begins to look down her nose at her. Now we can see this is a very human story, isn't it? But this is just the beginning of the problems that are going to arise out of this entanglement. Things are going to get a whole lot worse. So what does Sarah say? She says, Abraham, this is all your fault. I did it, but it's your fault. Now she's obviously angry and she's bitter and she's upset. And she's also doing what psychologists today would call blame shifting. But what's intriguing to me about her position is the lack of logic. Whose idea was this in the first place? Do you remember it was her? It was she who went to Abraham and suggested that he do this. Yet now she's blaming him, in a sense, for doing what she said, for acting on what she recommended. But I want to consider something else. It's worth noting that at this point in the story, in this chapter 16, there are three characters here. So at this point, she's clearly feeling that she's being treated unjustly. After all, as I said, Sarah was the one who came to her and told her to do it, and she just did what her mistress told her. But I do believe that in some degree she was culpable because she was showing disrespect for her mistress. Although it's, on a human terms, it's understandable to say that for her, the whole situation was probably becoming almost unbearable. So I think that's where she felt at this point she was probably thinking, oh, what a mess have I got myself into. Does God care? Does God even know I exist? Look at this mess. It wasn't even my idea. But I do think Hagar is guilty of pride. I get that from the fact that she disrespects her mistress. And because of that, Sarah begins to treat her harshly. Now, no doubt Abraham is also culpable in this situation. Because now, when this problem arises, it appears to me to be passive, or has been passive, and he certainly didn't step in earlier on and nip this matter in the bud. But as someone who once said, summarizing this passage, they said, Hagar failed as a maid, Sarah failed as a mistress, and Abraham failed as a man and head of the family. So this is a triple failure. Failure written all over this passage, friends. What a mess. And you know what? You haven't even heard the half of it yet. Look at the next verse, verse 6. Your slave is in your hands, Abraham said. Do with her whatever you think best. Then Sarah mistreated Hagar, so she fled from her. In other words, Abraham is doing what many men have been doing for thousands of years. He's saying, don't get me involved in this situation. She's your maid, you sort it out. At that point, Sarah's actions become totally wrong, because Sarah mistreats Hagar so badly to the point that she runs away. I think when Hagar ran away, she was asking those questions I posed at the beginning when we started looking at this chapter 16. Questions like, does God care about me? Does God even care about what's going on in my life? Isn't that a question we're still asking today? So, what a mess. I don't know any other way to say it. Sarah failed as a wife, Hagar failed as a maid, and Abraham failed as a husband and a man as well. That describes this entire situation. So at this point, we see Hagar flees the scene. Now, the next part of the passage we're going to look at describes the intervention of God. We know that if this mess is going to get cleaned up, it's such a tricky one, God's going to need to get involved. Now, I think the question the angel of the Lord asks, he already knows the answer to. The Lord didn't ask to seek information. I believe he's asking Hagar in order to get her to think about it and bring her to a point of self-awareness, I suppose I could describe it as. And her reply is, I'm running away from my mistress Sarai. Now, by the way, Hagar was an Egyptian, remember that, and the fact that she's on the road to Shur means she's heading back to Egypt. So the angel of the Lord, on this occasion, he appears and he gives Hagar some instructions. Now, I want to talk about some of the details going on here that I believe bring this passage right up into the 21st century. In the first place, he says to Hagar, go back to your mistress. That's the will of God for you, and that's what I want you to do. But in the meantime, I'm going to tell you that this pregnancy that you have, it will lead to the birth of a son. Now, this is before ultrasound, of course, so she would have had no way of knowing at that point whether she was going to have a male or a female child. But you're going to have a son, the Lord says, and I'm telling you to name him Ishmael. Now, the name Ishmael simply means God hears. So he's saying, I want you to name your son in such a way that you will never forget what I've told you today. But he then warns her, that son's going to be a bit of a wild, untamed animal. He's going to wreak havoc everywhere he goes. Everybody's going to be against him, and he's going to be against everybody. So that raises the question, who Ishmael represents? Who is Ishmael the father of today? Well, the answer to that question is the Arab nations. Now, I want to be clear here. I'm not some Christian Bible teacher making an unsubstantiated claim here. Absolutely not. In fact, in the Arab world, they also claim on both biblical and Quranic authority that they are indeed the children of Ishmael. So the next time you read the newspaper and the Jews and Arabs are going at it, remember Genesis 16 and all that happened there, because all this happened because Abraham spent one night in a tent with the wrong woman. Notice this text says that it is the Lord that speaks to her. So she'll not only name the child as instructed, but names the place that it happens, Bir Larahai, Oroi, which is an indication that she's naming it because that's the place that the Lord saw her and she met with the Lord. So God heard her, God saw her, and God cared for her. And I would suggest that that is the main point of this passage, the main message. He heard Hagar's plea, he saw her plight, and he cared for her in person. And he sees and cares about everything that was going on in her life. And that would maybe teach us something as well.
the Lord really cared about Hagar. Now, he also cared about Sarah, who is perhaps relieved to have got rid of her maid, but the Lord is saying that to Hagar, that he wants her back where she's supposed to be. Now, God cared about Hagar, even though that you might say that she was only a runaway slave, wasn't she? And she was a guilty runaway slave, guilty of disrespecting her mistress and of showing a real sense of pride. But if we think about that, that tells us that God still cared about her in spite of those factors, and that God cares about everybody, even in the lowest of the people in the societies in which we live. But he cared about her even though she was a very disobedient servant in the sense that she ran away. So she wasn't a guiltless person, she was a guilty person. If the Lord is seen to care about a runaway slave at such a profound level, well, think about how much he might care about you, who he redeemed by the blood of his Son. So there we are. Abraham is 86 years old, and Hagar gives birth to this child Ishmael. Abraham then returns to Hebron, which is where Hagar bore this child. So Abraham obeyed the Lord's command and named the child Ishmael. It took a while to get there in the end, but in the end they both obeyed the Lord. So we're getting towards wrapping this chapter up, and I want to finish by making a few observations. The sums of this passage is this: when Abraham didn't wait patiently in the Lord, great conflict resulted. Hagar, in her distress, called on the Lord, and the Lord graciously heard her, and he blessed her with a son who himself would have numerous descendants as well. Now that's an interesting story, but it's a complicated story to understand what it means in the context of the New Testament and for us today. But in Galatians, Paul tries to unpack it and explain it to us. In Galatians chapter 4, Paul does something very unusual. He allegorizes this scripture. Now that's a very unusual and strange thing for Paul to do. It's one of the few examples when he does something like this. But it's super important to understand why he did it, because it helps us understand what is really going on here and what it means for us today, both within its New Testament context and how we live our lives today. And Paul, using this allegoration technique, goes to great length to try and explain what all of this means. One method of biblical interpretation, which is very favoured amongst many, is referred to the literal method of interpretation. It says you should always take the Bible at face value. In this occasion, if it's talking about Sarah, it means Sarah, and if it says Hagar, it just means this person called Hagar. Now, these people did actually live, and what they did in this chapter and what we see in this chapter did actually take place. And the literal interpretation of Scripture is, of course, right and proper, and it should always be the first point of call for anybody who wishes or believes themselves to be a Christian. But on certain occasions, the Bible can also be interpreted in other ways. The allegorical method of interpretation is when someone says this passage of Scripture may be more than just historical, that the story represents something other than just the historical facts. So many people are quite shocked when they find in Galatians chapter 4, Paul approaches this scripture in this particular allegorical way. And what he chooses to do, he says that Hagar represents the Mosaic covenant and that Ishmael is the fruit of legalism, which is slavery. He also says that Sarai represents the Abrahamic covenant and that Isaac, who will be introduced later, is the fruit of that covenant, representing those who are born free of the law and those of us who can flourish under grace. But he also points out the fact that the children of the flesh will always persecute the children of the promise. And that's Paul's allegory in Galatians chapter 4. Every other time Paul refers to the Old Testament, he pretty much takes it literally, and he doesn't allegorize it anywhere else, except in this passage in Galatians 4. The other thing I would like to say is that Paul does not say that the passage itself is an allegory. There's an important distinction here. The Greek phrase that he uses saying this passage being allegorized, so he doesn't say the passage itself is an allegory. He says that in order to get his point across, on this occasion to rather thick-headed people in the church in Galatia, he is writing to them and he's going to allegorize this passage
in order to make his point. But Paul is not saying that the passage itself is primarily an allegory, but he's saying, I'm going to take this passage and allegorize it to make my point. So the story, if you remember, began with Sarah being barren, and then how she took matters into her own hands, which didn't solve anything because it was only seen to cause complications and conflicts. And then the story ends with Sarah still barren, so nothing solved there, and her great idea of bringing Hagar into the equation hasn't really solved the problem, has it? And the relationship at the end between Sarah and Hagar is not even seen to be resolved. So it's all a bit of a mess. So what's the spiritual principle here? What is being taught here? Well, I believe that the big picture is trying to tell us that resorting to worldly solutions rather than waiting on God to provide answers will always create problems. This story shows that human failure creates a mess, but the story also illustrates that that same human failure will not frustrate God's plans. God said, I'm going to use these children for my purpose. So as a result of Sarah's idea, Ishmael is born, and he gives birth to the Arab nations. And just as God predicted, the Arabs have been in conflict with the Jews ever since. What a mess. And all because one couple did not trust the Lord, and they did not wait upon the Lord for the fulfillment of the promise that he'd made. They did not wait for him to do that which God said he would do. So one of the great lessons I think we can all take from situations like this is don't try and take these situations into your own hands and think you can solve them. The best plan is always to wait on the Lord and let him solve the problem. Now, in contrast, Hagar in this passage, of all people, is seen as the one in this situation who calls upon the name of the Lord. She cries out to God, which is what Sarah should have done in the first place. This tells me that when we call on the Lord, no matter who we are, the Lord hears our plea and sees our plight and cares about us. God cares about you. That's the big picture here. He hears our prayers and he sees any situation that we're in. And he cares about us even when that situation is not our fault, or when it's partly our fault, or even when it's completely our fault. So friends, given the fact that you and I are just sinful human beings, and that means that a catastrophe might be waiting just around the corner, or that at any point one of life's tragedies may strike, then the question should raise from this passage is, what can we do to strengthen ourselves, to fortify ourselves against such eventualities? Well, this tells me that we should remember that the Lord knows, and that the Lord sees everything, and that the Lord cares. So my prayer is that we are all able to leave chapter 16 knowing that the Lord knows more about the situation that you currently find yourself in than you do, right? And he cares about it more than you, and in a deeper, insightful way, more so than you. And that he's going to work his purposes out even in the midst of any mess you might be in, even if that mess is of your own creation. Remember the Lord sees, remember the Lord hears, and remember the Lord cares. And also that at the right time the Lord will intervene to bring about his plan and his purpose in your life. And that, I believe, is the message of Genesis chapter 16.